We have Marlene Swift with the RCMP Victim Services.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Gary for sending me some time ago information about this board. My name is Marlene Swift, and I've had the honor of serving in this community for the last 13 years with Police-Based Victim Services. I'm the program manager. Before I go into some of the concerns I have, for those who don't know a little bit about my story, and I'm not going to go into detail, but back in 1983, I was almost a statistic on the highway. I wasn't hitchhiking, I was working, and at the time I was working, I was driving cab at the time, one of the few ventures I have. And this young man pulled a knife to my throat and asked me to turn around and go to Terrace. He sexually assaulted me, stole the cab, and left me on the highway just outside of Prudent Lake. I crawled along the ditch for a little period of time until I flagged down a vehicle that actually was going to Terrace, and I asked him to drive me back to Rupert to the RCMP. My first involvement with the RCMP, 1983. There was no victim services, there was no transition house. There was the RCMP. And I was brought into there, and to this day, I wish I knew the officer's name, and I keep asking something to try and find out for me, but I can't get it. I was treated with respect, I was treated with sensitivity, and the officer took my statement, explained to me what was going to happen, and stayed with me from that time on. I can fully understand how the families feel when something happens to their loved one, because my family was irate. They hadn't yet caught this young man until a few hours later. The treatment of First Nations women, I thought at the time, was a travesty, and still today it is, in a lot of situations. I became more so of an alcoholic and addicted to drugs, to block out the fear, constant fear I had that this individual was going to come and find me. He managed to escape to New Brunswick, where he was apprehended by the RCMP, and brought back into Prince Rupert, where I had to go to court a year later. By that time, 2 weeks before the trial, Crown Counsel had asked me, and I had no dealings with court in those days, in spite of my addiction. Crown Counsel had asked me to take a plea, and I refused. I had been through hell for a year, I wasn't about to give in now. And I said, if you're going to go for the works, then go for the gusto. The man eventually got 5 years for sexually assaulting me, robbery, and everything else. And unfortunately, I don't think that's the case today, in some of the cases. I was fortunate. 2 weeks before trial, I stopped my drinking and my drug addiction. I became involved in the addictions field for a period of time. And in Prince Rupert, it's a sad thing to say, the problem still exists today. It's a major, major problem in this community. The addiction problem, whether it's alcohol or drugs, it's still there. And unfortunately, our young people are getting more into the alcohol and drugs than ever before. Our people, like I heard it saying, are hurting. And it seems like we don't know how to help them. I've worked with the RCMP now for 13 years, and I'm truly blessed. I've worked with many fine officers. And never, if I've asked a question, have I ever been denied an answer. My first involvement with one of the cases that came to me was from a mother who's now passed away, and she was a dear friend of mine. her daughter was missing from the downtown east side. And her picture was up on posters, and she called me and asked me, Marlene, can you help me? And I became involved right away. And I worked with this lady for years after. In fact, that file is still open in my office. I keep in touch with her family to this day. When she was asked to provide a DNA case, when her DNA, when the Picton person, Robert Picton, was going to trial, she asked me to explain what was going to be happening. So I stood with her, and the officer brought her in and explained to her with sensitivity. And I've never, I hear a lot about the RCMP, unfortunately not good. Very seldom do I hear of the good things they do. But they explained to her what was going to happen and stayed with her, and we kept her updated, and that file is in Vancouver PD right now. Unfortunately, the mother passed away before any results of whether her daughter was one of the missing on the Picton farm. I next became involved in a file in 2005 when I marched with the Transition Society in the highway, Take Back the Highway. It was the first time I shared my personal story. And I realized just how fortunate I am, because so many were out there missing. So many were out there lost or murdered. I'm pleased to say I worked with Vicki, and I'm honored to know her, and I realize and understand her frustration of not having the answers that she still seeks. Through our victim services, I've been honored to work with Gary Coons as well. We brought awareness into Bella Coola not all that long ago. I sit on the provincial committee of OCTAP. I sit on the local Salvation Army, or the provincial committee of Salvation Army against sexual exploitation and human trafficking. But it starts with each one of us. And what our victim services has done, and I'm fortunate, I'm part Ukrainian. And I always have a battle going on. It's between my bow hunting side of my Ukraine and my First Nations. I'm Sintian, by the way. Half the time they keep telling each other, which one's going to win, but I persevere. I gather strengths from both. I haven't touched a drink. Actually, I was out on Saturday afternoon to the suicide awareness and did a bit of a talk there. Our program and our staff, there's only 2 of us. We're very proactive. Not only are we involved in the community and many things that go on in the community, we travel into different parts of the province. I've traveled into the villages doing workshops on violence and relationships. Traveled into, our program goes down to Hartley Bay, Clun 2 actually, if I remember correctly. We now encompass Clun 2. Hartley Bay, Kekapa, Methacapa, Loch Lambs, Port Edward. That's a huge area to cover. And I know many First Nations people, and I know many in this room, and I'm honored to be here with you as well. So I traveled into these places and did workshops on many different types of topics, and I've always learned the first thing I did when I started with victim services is ask the question, what do I do when I go into these communities? I'm so petrified because I wasn't born on the reserve, I was born in Prince Rupert, and I wanted to learn how to be respectful of my people. And the first thing is go and seek out an elder and ask them what the community wants, what they need. And that's what I did. So before I go into any community, I always ask them, what can I offer you and provide for you? So our program staff is very busy. One of the things we implemented a few years ago, and I heard it mentioned a little earlier about officers and professionals, we started cross-cultural training, not cross-cultural training, Tsimshian cultural training for our First Nations, for our officers that came into the detachment. We took them over to a reserve, had them sit there all day. There's a few in this room here, a lieutenant, that is really good. I'm actually working on another one. But not only did we bring that to our First Nation, to our officers, we opened it up to professionals in the community to come and attend with us. People who were new to the community if they wanted to come. And they didn't have to pay a dime. That came out of our victim services budget. And unfortunately our budget got cut this year. So what do you address about that? But yet our caseload is still the same. Our office is on call 24/7. And if an officer calls me and says to me, Marlene, I need you here or I need you there, 2 o'clock in the morning, and as old as I am, I get up and I go. I'm getting up in years, but my heart is in this community and will always be. Victims in my mind come first, always. So I have no problem getting up at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, or 5 o'clock to go and address somebody's needs. I've no problem going down the stairs at my office when somebody pops in off the street to come and talk to me and say, hey, I've got a daughter missing down south, can you help me? And I really pray, Molly, that your daughter will show up. Thank you. The officers, I would just want to mention, when we talk about awareness on the highway, one of the officers, and I want to make mention of it, had come to my office and let me know that he had stopped a young girl who was trying to run away to Terrace. The family had phoned in. He pulled her over and asked her to get into the car and asked her what she was doing. He says, I hope I did the right thing, Marlene. He said, I brought her back home. Can you call the family? These are things that go unrecognized, that our officers are taking the time to do. The information that I passed on about the missing girl was through and received by my supervisor. When I went to him, without hesitation, he gave me the information and said, here, thank you, staff, for that. And I forwarded it on. So I am really, truly privileged for where I work, because I know how difficult it is for many First Nations people to come forward and speak. I know how difficult it is for an officer to try to understand, here we go again, because they're being spit on and degraded by many people that they're trying to help. I know how difficult it is for Gary, who travels down south constantly back to the Parliament buildings, trying to provide some answers for his large constituency up here. And I respect all those I work with, and I respect everybody in this room. Thank you.
I've got a question for Marty. You stood down too quickly.
I can hear you.
You started 13 years ago, did you?
That's correct.
Okay, I think that would probably put you. Okay, we had 2 ladies, exceptional ladies with the court system, court victim services. Those positions were abolished. Are you familiar with what they did? Because I found you were exceptional people.
Yes, yes, and the government at that time, that was a position that I was really sorry to see go, because they were definitely, I also, before I stop here, I also want to recognize this young lady, if you will, please, would you stand up? She's the new community-based victim services personnel here in Prince Rupert. Her name's Danielle LeBlanc, and we just started to get to know one another and start to working together in this community. So she's with the community-based that worked out of the Community Enrichment Society. But when they stopped the Crown Victim Services position, yes, it was a very
It's like a hole opened up.
yes.
Yeah, because my experience there was on a personal matter, because I was being victimized, but in the process of going to see them, I got to see a glimpse of who they dealt with and how they dealt. And we don't have that kind of services. They were professional, okay? And when you're dealing with sexual abuse, small, young individuals, it takes a special person to be able to get through to them, to really help them. We've lost that. This is what I wanted to bring attention to.
Can I interrupt you for a second? Okay. I have been a victim of sexual abuse from the age of 4 to 14. So I understand, okay? I fully understand what a victim is going through in their families, okay? I was a victim again in 1983, and today I choose not to be a victim. I am a survivor, and I hope with my experiences and my compassion for people that I can help people in this community to where they don't have to remain a victim. Okay?
If you don't mind, let me just ask a couple of questions, Ms. Swift. I've been asked to use the microphone so that the screaming will take place, and then I'll give you the microphone if you don't mind so you can answer. Okay? I'm sorry to be inconvenient about it, but I think it's best. And one of the things that I do think is really helpful is for someone with your background to come and tell us about the events that you think are very positive about the group you work for, and you've explained how you did with the RCMP 13 years, and that's helpful for us to hear. Let me just ask you a few questions, please. One of them, you mentioned this one officer who told you about stopping someone who run away, and presumably someone was on the highway, number 16. So the question I want to ask you is, in the symposium recommendations in 2006, there was a specific recommendation that the police not drive by hitchhikers, but rather stop and make inquiry to make sure there was a zone of safety. Are you familiar with that recommendation? And if so, can you tell us if that recommendation has been implemented?
To be truthful, at the time the symposium was in Prince George, I was a little bit ticked off because I was not invited to go. And I think there was a few down in this area. There was only a few from Prince Rupert that went, to my knowledge. So I have no idea what the recommendations are. I actually just pulled a copy of that, and I was going to read it on at home over the weekend. But I devoted up time 24/7 to this test, so I didn't read it. But I don't know, to be truthful with you, if that was as a result of the recommendations made. I know the officer did see someone on the highway, pulled over and brought the individual back to the residence.
And to ask another question, going from that same symposium, you've already told us that you were unfortunately able to attend, but there was a recommendation that there be increased highway patrols during the hitchhiking season, and this would of course relate to your RCMP work. Do you know if the RCMP, as far as you know, have increased patrols? But that was discussed in recommendation number 3.
Again, to be truthful with you, I don't know if that's the case. I do maybe a suggestion there with regards to patrols on the highway during interest season. We have a wonderful Inspector Kilbury, who's looked at a lot of issues that we have detachment meetings every so often, but maybe the way to go about that would be to utilize the citizens on patrol or auxiliary officers.
Now, thank you. Let me ask you one other question about the recommendation. There was concern about the lack of communication between RCMP and victim families. In your 15 years, do you see a growing interest between the RCMP and victims' families and having better communication? In other words, have you seen a difference over the 13 years you've been doing this work for the RCMP?
Well, I'm going to be a little biased here. Yes, I do see a difference. And I think a lot of our office, especially maybe it's because I'm First Nations, our clients ratio are about 95% First Nations clients. And just I made a point of talking with officers, introducing them to some of trying to introduce them to First Nations, our First Nations communities, and I believe there is definitely a rapport building there, but it's a slow process. Like Louisa said, there is a major distrust for many First Nations people, and that's not going to happen overnight. It's a slow healing process, and but I have seen a definite bridge building relationship going there.
That's good. One last question. We heard from Ms. Dixon, who mentioned about her difficulties in trying to make a phone call. Now, I gather from watching here today, you know Ms. Dixon. I think you mentioned that you passed on your regards to her. Can you help us understand how that event might have happened, where there was a problem with having the ability to use the phone with the RCMP? She ultimately, unfortunately, was able to go to the Salvation Army for that. Can you help us with that?
At that particular time, I was unaware that there was an open file in North Vancouver. So a suggestion, and once I received the information from my staff sergeant, I then forwarded, I called Vancouver myself to ask what was happening. As I do in a lot of files, I not only have files here in country, but I have files that are private wide. And I make a point of doing a follow-up every at least once a month, depending on what type of case it is. So when I did a follow-up to North Vancouver to ask what was happening, I asked the officer, would he please contact. And this is something that I really recommend that no matter what the case is, there's somebody involved with the file that they make constant contact with the victims because they want to know what is happening. Whether it's one, I have a policy, I contact victims at least once a month, whether there's anything new happening or not, just to touch base with them and see how well they're doing. And it depends how far along in the case it is going. So what happened downstairs as to why she wasn't giving assistance, my office is upstairs in the detachment, and I wasn't, she didn't come back until a few days later. It was brought to my attention she was having difficulty coming to see me, and I did the best I could at the time with what information I could get.
We have two more individuals, Marlene Swift. Oh, sorry, I didn't check you off. Okay, I forgot you. Darlene Wolf, sorry.
Good afternoon, chiefs, matriarchs, ladies and gentlemen, special guests, committee. I didn't know I was going to be talking today, but I was listening about a week ago. CFNR was doing a little blurb, and they said that the percentage of women that are gone missing is increasing rapidly. And what they're concerned too was that the percentage of males that are missing is increasing, and the majority is First Nations. Prince Rupert is over 90% First Nations from all nations, and all the presentations were good, and it woke up something. Back in the 1980s, I worked for the RCMP. And when they were looking through the files, they seen that there was a pattern of almost every 4 years. And they were brainstorming and stuff like that. And so we hear that it has been going on for many, many years. It's way too long. And I remember as a child hearing a dead Indian is a good Indian. And it seems like it's still the same story. My sister was murdered in the early 70s in Alberta. And then RCMP there said that it was an alcohol issue. She phoned and phoned the night before. And we sent her a bus ticket in the morning before the RCMP called us. Her clothes and her purse were gone. Everything was gone. And when her body came home, it was broken. Her face was black and blue. We had to have a closed casket. And the police said that they wouldn't do anything more. They wouldn't look into it anymore because she was a drunk Indian. I'm wondering committee here is getting dizzy. I'm not being facetious. It just feels like we're going in circles. Everything, the committees, money's being spent for offices and wages and trips and inquiries. But there's no money for setting up offices or committees or groups. And any money that is there is not enough. And many of these committees have very few First Nations sitting on them. Our people don't trust RCMP. We've heard that this afternoon over and over. And a lot of them won't talk to First non-natives. And that's still true today. Prejudice and hurt runs very deep. When I worked for the RCMP, I guess you could call me, was a victim of rape. I was raped by an RCMP officer. He had a gun to me, and he said, "This is how I get all my Indian women." All my other supervisors in the RCMP there were very, very comforting. Had me in a meeting, made me tell my story. And then this RCMP from out of town came in, and they called them in. I was told I wasn't going to lay charges, that they were going to deal with him themselves. When he left, he gave me the gun, you know, the gun. My bosses all said that he just more or less got a slap on the hand. I was told that he was going to be watched, and if anything else happened, he was going to be dealt with severely. There are good cops, there are bad cops, there are good people and bad people in every walks of life. And I always say, if we as First Nations people could put away our own prejudices and our hate and our pain and our anger and our jealousy and join with each other with all the other First Nations and stand together, can you imagine how powerful a people we would be? The government would be able to listen to us then. We need to work together. Perhaps it's time the First Nations picked up the torch. RCMP need cultural training. We are First Nations, but each nation has their own culture and traditions. I used to get in trouble all the time when I started working for government departments because I would not look at my supervisors in the eye. To me, I was taught that that was disrespectful, and I was always in trouble. Today, 3 hours isn't enough for meetings like this. 3 hours is nothing for our families and the women that have disappeared and the ones that we don't even know about. Like our residential school children who had to dig graves and they had no idea what they were digging graves for, and they were 5 years old and 4 years old and they didn't know what these holes were for. These were for the dead children. There were people who were told that their children ran away, and our people are still waiting, hoping generations after that someone will walk through the door that was once their child. What I would like to know is, when does the real work begin? I hope it starts today.